I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak with TNT Sports broadcaster Matt Smith today. As someone who's gone from seeing you cover football on the TV to having the opportunity to work with you and now have the chance to sit down and talk to you on the podcast, I've really been looking forward to this conversation. And hopefully I've got some good questions lined up. Thank you for joining me. How are things?
Of course, and I'm looking forward to it too, Max. Yeah, no, nice to obviously get the chance to chat in a bit more depth than we did the first time we worked together. And yeah, I have no doubt your questions will be far too searching and interesting for the likes of me.
How have things been at the start of the new season for you?
Good, yeah, good. I was at the Paris Olympics for Eurosport, obviously part of Warner Brothers Discovery, so I had nearly 3 weeks out there, which was great. Squeezed a quick family holiday in, and then was in Monaco, of all places, last week for the Champions League and Europa League and Conference draws. So it sounds slightly more glamorous than maybe it is often, the kind of dashing about and going to these seemingly glamorous places, but it's kind of more work than play, obviously. A couple of days at home, and I'd also fitted in a commentary on Serie A last weekend as well when I got back from Monaco. And yeah, gearing up now for obviously the new season in European competitions in Serie A and Premier League and all that goes with that for TNT and beyond.
Great. And I really look forward to talking to you about that later on. But I wanted to start this one off picking up where I left off with my last guest, Seb Hutchinson. It was on the subject of nostalgia in football and how things have changed. One of Seb's points was that there's now an increased focus on the finances and ownership within the game, which, if you think a team selling a couple of hotels makes more headlines than the Ballon d'Or shortlist, then I think he's got a point with that one. But I understand the answer to this question may vary depending on age, but I wanted to ask you, what era would you consider the golden age of football?
I don't know that I would say there was a golden age of football. I'm not actually as drawn to the kind of nostalgia. I find the newness, the ever reinvention of the game just as interesting as wandering down memory lane. In fact, probably more interesting in a way. I don't mind kind of living, well, not living in the past, but looking back at days that we might have all enjoyed as either supporters or broadcasters or whatever we've been, players, coaches, etc. And those can lend themselves to great storytelling and all that stuff. But I don't get too stuck in the past, to be honest. I mean, you obviously end up thinking about the formative years of your life and kind of where the game was in that period. And that for me would be kind of early, mid-80s, really, as a young teenager on Merseyside. And although I didn't intend at all to finish up in this industry, I was always a big sports fan and a football fan. So that was very much at the forefront of my interest back then. So yeah, watching my family team, my dad's team is Liverpool. So that was a good time to be a Liverpool fan. Obviously a pretty dominant team in that period, albeit from the mid-80s to the early 90s, clearly after Heysel, Liverpool, amongst all the other English clubs, were banned from Europe. So that was a big black hole, I suppose, football-wise, for me, given that I'm particularly interested and connected with European football. But a pretty good time to watch the game change, as it always does.
Yes, most definitely. And that time period is one that I've spent quite a lot of time sort of researching and well interested in. And it's an interesting point that you raised, given the European ban, that it comes during a time where European English sides were so dominant in the European game. So I do think that's a really interesting time. Over the summer, I was working on a research project that centered around Real Madrid's English players of the past, with a specific focus on David Beckham. I found an old ITV Sport programme on the archive where you and Andy Townsend were discussing Beckham's transfer from United, which I think was 2003.
It was.
Whilst Real Madrid were on a pre-season tour in Asia, and seeing the likes of Ronaldo, Roberto Carlos, Luis Figo, I think that sort of lent itself to asking that question. But also what struck me was, the advancements in set design from then to now. with the use of green screen and AI that you see today, as well as just how crisp the new cameras are. From an industry perspective, what have been the biggest changes in your career as a sports broadcaster?
Well, there's been obviously a lot of changes because I'm so old that I started such a long time ago. There's been a lot of technical and technological change. I think the biggest change, obviously, has been the advent of handheld portable technology in terms of phones and pads and so on, that has allowed us all to kind of be connected and almost become citizen fan journalists, really. So it's blurred the lines between the old-fashioned way of working and the modern way, which now exists and flourishes and gives everybody really that wants to something of a platform to get involved, which is great. It's healthy. So I think that's been the biggest change. That coupled with social media, which is another offshoot of the same tech, really, and that conversation that happens now almost daily, almost minute by minute online, positives and negatives with that. But I suppose I would say from a broadcasting point of view, both in news where I started in current affairs and then in sport where I've been for the last 25 plus years, some things don't really change, really. The importance of story and storytelling, the importance of voices in terms of testimony, first-hand and second-hand, that help support that storytelling, the kind of critical ability to analyze and condense and pick and choose the elements that go into a story and present that to an audience and think about what makes it interesting, entertaining, insightful, informative, all those typical kind of cliched watchwords, which are all true. Those things don't change. And in some ways, what I learned when I started applies just as much today as it ever did, really. I think maybe the tech changes, the opportunity blossoms, but the same ways in which we deliver something good, we hope, to an audience that they want to consume is built on the same foundations.
That's very interesting. Thinking then, going off what you've said, in a world pre-citizen journalism, what was it like for you? Obviously, predating your time in sports media, as you mentioned, wanting to make a breakthrough in the world of news. What was it like for you trying to break through as someone from Merseyside? As I imagine around that time, it would have been difficult to some extent.
Yeah, I suppose I was at the end of an era where the kind of regional accents were not welcomed. I wouldn't say they were like any kind. I wasn't in a period where you were told, well, you can't go on air with sounding like that. I was definitely after that time. And in fact, you could argue not long after I'd started, there was a kind of shift towards almost wanting to represent, which is quite right, represent the people that live all around this country. So we should have, as we're now going on to find in other ways, diversity and inclusion and ways that we can all find to represent the audience that we serve. That's what we should have been doing from the start, frankly. But I wouldn't say I felt kind of terribly hindered, but I think there was still a kind of, at the time I started, particularly in news, there was still a kind of, this is the way we do it. And it was quite structured and quite, not constraining, but there was a kind of, you were taught, particularly at the BBC where I really started as a broadcaster, you were taught in a particular way, and there wasn't a lot of room for, but what if I want to go over there and do that? Well, that wasn't news and current affairs. That was maybe, well, you go and work in another department then, if that's really how you feel, because we're not into creativity, we're into rigidity and discipline and those things that we just talked about before, that I think are true and I hold still very dear. But I think it has also allowed in modern times, because we can do things with our phones and we're not relying on a team of people that have all inherited a way of doing things. We can go out and make our own stuff. The creativity of an individual has been allowed to come to the fore more. And I think that's been healthy. So someone with a vision and idea can go and put that into practice, rather than saying to a production team, a broadcast giant like the BBC or ITV, I want to go and do this. And it starts to get shaped into the way that other people would like to see it. And that fits into a mold that is what went before. So it becomes a bit self-perpetuating. Now, I think the tech's allowed us all to do kind of what we want. But then it's a case of, does anybody want that? I've made it. I've started to make it. Is there a platform? Does anybody really want to watch it or listen to it or read it? Yeah. And that change. The platform's wide, but how deep is it?
Yeah, the net certainly seems to have been cast wider, but it is a matter of almost finding your niche, as you say. And on the subject of regional accents, your accent's obviously a lot better trained than mine. I was wondering if that was ever an obstacle that you had to sort of overcome, or something that you undertook training in at the beginning of your career? No?
No, no, definitely not. I mean, obviously, I grew up on the Wirral. Really, having been born in Liverpool, grew up on the Wirral, so maybe that softened it off. Maybe a bit more of a moany Scouse type, but it was probably a bit softer to start with. And obviously, I left that area in terms of living there when I was 18 to go to university. My course at university was actually in languages. So there's 4 years of my degree. I had 2 years abroad in France and Italy. I was always interested in language and accents and speech, and that fascination stayed with me all my life to this point, and will do for the rest of my life. So I loved all that, but I never made a conscious attempt to change the way I speak. If it was subconscious, that as kind of when I went on air, I became even more kind of rounded and soft and kind of generically northern. Did I do that on purpose? Definitely not. Did it happen anyway? I don't know, really. It's hard for me to say, because I don't know that I can judge what I sound like. I think I sound like myself all the time, and I've never tried to sound other than myself. I've always thought that it was important to be authentically yourself as a journalist. I don't think you want to be a performer in that sense. That's for a different profession. That's for acting and entertainment. That's not what I've ever done. So I've only ever tried to speak like me. But I suppose I was, yeah, you kind of, I suppose when you, particularly in news, when you're reading a script, a voiceover script, you are trying to make it clear, trying to pace it so that people can take it in. And maybe in that kind of disciplined environment, I developed a kind of on-air voice, but it wasn't an attempt to hide my accent. And no one ever said to me, you need to tone down whatever I had in terms of a kind of Merseyside accent.
That's really good to hear. And picking up on what you said about your time in France and Italy, I remember a couple of years ago, I spoke with Gabriele Marcotti, who has spent a lot of time, especially in his young years, across different countries around the world. And I asked him the question, as a product of that, what did he notice were the biggest differences between the people of the different countries he spent time in? And he flipped that on his head quite smartly, really, in that he said, rather than noticing the differences between the people, he noticed the commonalities and what the people share. So I guess I'd like to extend that to you. I'm sure it left a huge impression on you. As you know now, you still do the likes of Serie A and European football. So what were those experiences like for you?
Fantastic. Absolutely. The ability to go and spend time in another country is so broadening, so enjoyable. Obviously, it becomes that much more useful and enjoyable if you're able to converse with the people that live there, particularly in their own language. And the time I went to Italy first and France after. I spent most of my time in that student year in Pisa with a lot of students from all parts of Italy, virtually none of whom spoke any English, really, apart from perhaps the odd lyric from a pop song or whatever. I think that has changed, obviously, even in perhaps Southern Europe in the last generation, maybe, because English is an ever more dominant language, kind of commercially and politically and so on. And we get lazier as English speakers with that. Now, I think I would always have thought and would argue that Northern Europe, thinks about Holland, Germany, Scandinavia, folks from those countries probably speak better English than me, to be honest. They're taught from a very young age. And that has taken root in Southern Europe as well, because of necessity, I guess, from their point of view and their education system. But it was fantastic for me to be forced to learn quickly both Italian and French in order to converse with the people I was spending time with and get to know and become friends with, a lot of whom I'm still in touch with. And so it was a brilliant couple of years that I hold very dear, and it gave me a much broader sense of the world around me. But I think, as you rightly point out from Gab Marcotti's point of view, you can see difference, but you can also see similarity, and that might be something you do consciously or unconsciously. But in the end, I think we are social beings, aren't we, as humans? And we kind of want to get to know, or at least I do. And my curiosity is get to know other people and their habits, their cuisine, their habit, their dress sense, their music interests, obviously their sporting interests, and so on and so on. So the learning curve for me then becomes an exchange of information and opinion and all that stuff. And that was great. And I guess I passed a bit of my Englishness into those folks that I met in Italy and France, and their lifestyle came back to me, and I think we were all better for it.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting to hear. I read early on in your career that you spent time in radio. What are the biggest adaptations that you need to make when you're transitioning from an audio-based platform to being on screen?
So when I started at the BBC, I actually started on Breakfast News, which was a TV show, right. Obviously still is. So that was actually my first kind of introduction after having done a series for Channel 4 on foreign affairs. But my first kind of job, if you like, in broadcasting was at the BBC in TV. After which then I spent some time in the business and economics unit, unbelievably. I know people would think, well, what the hell does he know about that? And the answer is not much, but that's where I spent a few months. And then after that, moved into the sports department. And they have a great system, I think it's to this day at the Beeb, called attachments, which they also have an offshoot of now called hot shoes. And essentially, it's an ability for somebody within the whole church of the BBC, broad church of the BBC, to basically try somebody else's job. Or a job in another department for a period of a month up to 6 months, I think it can be. You don't lose your old job, but you get a chance to try something new and see if it's a better fit for you. And that's what I did. I had a period in radio sports, as it was then. It's all one department, but they were kind of slightly separate back then in the late 90s. There was a radio sports department and a radio sports room and newsroom in Broadcasting House, and the TV sports department was in Television Centre in Shepherd's Bush, as was then. So that was my first introduction to radio, and the big learning curve for me was partly from TV to radio and the power of spoken word and the importance of what you would call effects or background noise, and the ability to speak to a lot of people and canvass a lot of opinion, because obviously you need these other ingredients because you haven't got any pictures. But also I was coming out of news and going into sport, and the big transition in that is you go from almost always, or broadly speaking, scripted journalism into unscripted, ad-libbed journalism. So suddenly I was at football matches and at boxing events and various other sports events, and it was think on your feet, find the words, deliver them live down the microphone. Now, you wouldn't do that really very often unless you were particularly experienced and expert in a TV news environment. Obviously, you might see a Jeremy Bowen or John Simpson or whoever it might be come on the TV and talk you through a scenario, a latest from the Middle East or whatever it might be. And their experience allows them to ad-lib with great expertise. But you pick your words very carefully in news because you have to weigh the importance of them, and you don't want to get anything wrong, and you don't want to misrepresent and so on. It's serious stuff. Now, it's not to say sport isn't serious, but sometimes, often in a live environment, you're describing, you're trying to sum up what you're seeing, you're trying to add colour, you're using guests to enhance what you're doing, and radio needs voices and it needs sound. And suddenly I had to kind of think on my feet and develop my ability to deliver in the moment, and that was really useful and really important for me. And then that became useful for me as I then moved back into TV in a sports environment.
I can imagine. So I've had experiences of that to a certain extent, and I can definitely understand where you're coming from. Things such as the economy of words and whatnot. It really is a fascinating subject to dive into and analyze, because there's a lot of value in there, I feel. You mentioned earlier that the move to sport wasn't something that was necessarily planned.
No, it wasn't. No, I was doing a slot on what was then John Inverdale's program on 5 Live in the afternoon. He used to do the drive time program, and my little stint in the business and economics units, we used to go down and do a kind of update on whatever the news was from that world of finance and stuff in the afternoon for a couple of minutes. And as is the way with these things, you go into a radio studio and you wait outside, and then he'll maybe throw to, I don't know, the weather or the news or whatever, something that was happening outside of the studio. You nip in while basically he's off air. You can say hello, you can have a minute or so's catch up with the presenter, and then you go back live and you deliver your little bit that is obviously the bit that you would hear at home in the car, etc. And then you sneak out and the next person comes in. And in the time waiting to go on air, because John, obviously, although it was a news program, he has pretty much his whole career been a sports broadcaster. We used to chat about that. That was his interest, and he quickly worked out that I was a sports fan. And completely unbeknownst to me, in that time after a few weeks of doing that, he thought, well, this guy probably, maybe he'd be better off working in sport. I probably used to say to him, I don't know much about business. I don't know what I'm doing in this department, blah, blah, blah. And he went off and spoke to the then head of radio sport, a really great bloke called Bob Shannon. And next thing I know, there's a possibility to go and have a chat with Bob Shannon in the radio sports department. And he said, well, look, we have this attachment system. If you're interested, why don't you come over and have perhaps 3 to 6 months in the radio sports room and see how you get on? And as soon as he said it, I thought, yeah, why haven't I thought of that? I really hadn't thought of it. I don't know why, but as soon as he said that, it was like a door opened, both physically and figuratively, and I stepped through it.
Yeah, that's interesting for the career that you've gone on to have. I'm sure a very valuable milestone for you. And I was going to say, you've been a prominent figure as both a presenter and reporter at many high-profile sports events. The two roles have similarities, but are markedly different as far as their responsibilities. Are there differences in your preparation depending on whether you're presenting or reporting?
Sorry, the cat just knocked some flowers over in the courier room. Let's not worry about it. Run off in embarrassment and shame now. But these are the things that happen, aren't they, live? So that's what that combines the two roles. It is that ability, as we've talked about, to think on your feet and to be the product of the research that you do beforehand. I think you do, you research for the role and the program and the requirement of you within that. So if you're going to report, let's say on a Champions League game, you're going to be pitch side, contribute to the program from there, either as live or live. You're going to talk to players and managers pre and post match. You might also update the program even during the game if there's something to say from down on the side of the pitch to the commentary team above, and so on. Then you prepare for those specific parts of the program. If you're presenting that program, let's say you could be at stadium, but also you could be in a studio, then you're thinking perhaps more generally about the program as a whole, but you're still preparing for the bits that within it that will be your responsibility. So you're not thinking so much about what the reporter's going to do as the bits that you're going to be in charge of, i.e. the conversations in the studio, the saying hello, the linking into those other elements within the show, whether they're recorded or live, trying to get the arguments and discussion points across in a way that the audience will think are the kind of thing they'd want to know, the kind of thing they'd find interesting, entertaining, all those usual tidbits. And thinking about the overview of the program. Have we delivered to the folks at home what we set out to, and have we missed anything? Are we keeping an eye on things that are happening at that game, but also beyond that game? So you're doing a live program that might be Arsenal against Barcelona, but if suddenly an important figure within the world of football is taken ill, passed away, a governing body has just announced something to do with off-field activity, etc., you're just trying to make sure you don't miss any newsworthy element that the audience would want. Because again, the world we now live in, with people's phones, laptops, etc., you're almost never more than a few seconds away from the headlines, are you? It's not like tomorrow's news today and all that. It's happening right now. As soon as it's released into the public domain, everybody wants to know. And so you're trying to lend context and a sense of being across things that is the presenter's responsibility, really.
Yes, and there's also a huge element of what you mentioned earlier as far as thinking on your feet and adapting to what comes your way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that applies across, I think, all live programming. That's the difference, obviously, between live and non-live, is that you only get the one chance. And when it's done, you can't make it any better. So you can pack up your bag and go home and think, did my best, leave it behind. Don't let it follow you around and beat you up and all that stuff. That's not the way it should be. you prepare, deliver to the best of your ability. Yeah, of course, reflect and learn and try and get better, but trying to think about, I could have said this, could have said that. Don't know how helpful that can be a lot of the time. Think about what you do next time rather than beating yourself up about what you did this time. That's a better use of your time. And in terms of, I think a lot of people ask about, do you watch stuff back? I would always say people should. I'm not a great one for it, but I think you should, particularly as you're learning to become the best version of yourself on screen or on air. But I would always say, give it a couple of weeks if you can, with the ability to record and watch things back. You're a bit emotionally connected when you've just done something and you're kind of picking over what your hair looks like and the stupid things that don't matter to anybody except you. So give it a couple of weeks and you become more of a viewer, and you can stand a little bit further back and pick the holes in it or the bones out of it more objectively, more constructively.
Yes, this is a really interesting subject to go into, I feel, because I think it's relatable for a lot of people, especially those aspiring to make a break in the industry. Did it take you a certain amount of time to reach that level of understanding of your own self-critic? Because I could imagine for most people when they are younger, well, like for example, if I was to use my own personal experience, I think my self-critic is one of my biggest motivators in order to achieve and to hold myself to a standard. So for you, was there a point in your career where you sort of evolved how you look at that?
I think you go through stages, because I think these skills, if you like, or experiences, whatever word you want to use to describe the set of tools that you come to lean on air, you go through, they're learned. You go through a set of phases in terms of hopefully improving. You're right, I think, to point out that we should all want to be the best version of ourselves we can be, and you have to be self-critical, you have to be self-aware, you have to be willing to think about how to improve. And I think you can never get into the habit of patting yourself on the back and thinking, well, I just do this now. That's not a great mindset, I would suggest, for anybody. Always learning, always trying to be the best you can be, picking up magpie style things from other people and so on. Not trying to be somebody else, but always trying to pick up tidbits from whoever and wherever and whatever you come across. But you start off, I think, as a younger person, wanting to be authentic and knowledgeable and well researched in your subject, in this case sport, football, whatever, because you want to be taken seriously. You want to be given a degree of acceptance, and you seek that from your peers and obviously from the audience. Then that becomes perhaps a phase that you have to go through a little bit, where that is you're a bit prone to over displaying that knowledge as you glean it, as you pick it up, as you become more knowledgeable about your subject. You probably try a bit too hard to display that knowledge to the audience, to the guest or whatever. You try and make sure people realize that you know your stuff. And then as you get a bit more mature, hopefully you get out of that phase and you realize you can be much more selective about what you know in terms of what you actually say. And I think that's where you're aiming for, is knowing stuff doesn't mean having to say stuff. Have it almost up your sleeve. If you need it, use it. But if you don't need it, you don't have to say it. And yes, you don't want to be too assumed knowledge and get into that kind of sport, football bubble, which is natural for players and coaches to be in, because they spend all day, every day thinking about their role in the professional game. And they talk, obviously, a kind of code and a language that applies to that elite level. And you can fall into the trap of wanting to understand and be part of that. You're not part of that. You're on the outside of it, looking in. So don't be part of the club. Be the observer, be the analyst the best you can be, thinking about the right questions. But you don't have to tell everybody and show everybody how much you think you know.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice as far as podcasts and broadcasting and programs. One of the things I was told, which I think has been quite valuable to me, is that more often than not, people are watching the programs or listening to the podcasts for the guest, not the presenter. So touching on what you said earlier, you tend to maybe overcompensate for wanting to let people know, what research you've carried out or the extent of your knowledge. So I do think that's a really good piece of advice. Just to touch back on presenting and reporting. I feel like from my time on different sets, presenters are responsible for moving along the running order, creating the mood of the broadcast, whilst reporters, although maybe more constrained by time, seem to have the liberty of being more creative in that they can spend time and ask questions to players and athletes. Do you think one of the roles allows for more freedoms than the other?
I hadn't really thought of it like that. I suppose in some ways, when a running order is put together by a production team, by an editor or producer, or whatever, they will probably think a bit more about the elements that are directly under their control to some extent, and that might be the studio. And so they think about, yeah, well, I'd like this to get this from the pundits in the conversation there, and I want therefore you as the presenter to try and get through that part of the discussion, etc. And they maybe think a little bit less. Well, we're going to go to the reporter pitch side at this point in the program, at which point they'll do their 2 minutes with or without a guest. They'll give us the team news, whatever, and it's kind of left to you a little bit more to do whatever you think is germane. So maybe in that sense, there's a little bit more freedom, albeit you've only got that relatively short window to do your stuff in. So I suppose they are slightly different, but really, I think again the same disciplines, the same focus, and the same thinking about how do I add value to this program? How do I get the other people in the program to shine? How do we all work as a team to get the stuff that we think is useful and interesting and colourful to the audience at home? That's, if you keep asking yourself that question, basically, is it worth asking? Is it a fair question? Then you can't go far wrong, really. You don't really need much more than that. Now, obviously it's subjective. People find different things interesting. That we're in a world now where we're going ever more towards a data-driven approach, particularly in football. Does everybody love that? No. But is it a direction of travel? Yes. So it would be a bit Luddite-like to say, I'm not interested and I'm not discussing and I'm not bothered about XG and everything else that goes with the data-driven approach. Equally, do we need to subsume ourselves in stats all the time and kind of almost reduce a sport to numbers? No, I don't think so. I think people at home need a bit of both. They need a bit of context and a bit of information, but they also need some opinion, some light-hearted stuff, some colour, and some context that helps that information come to life. They need, really, most people at home want something to take away for themselves.
Qualitative data, yeah. Storytelling. Would it be fair to say that is what you prioritise in your research approach?
Yeah. Essentially the role of a journalist is to read through, to watch through, to expose yourself to a whole load of information, of research, and then you're always boiling that down into what you think is worth passing on. That you're a condenser, really, of a broad spectrum of information into a bit less, and you hope the best bits of what you've spent your days preparing for, and turning that into something more bite-sized, more manageable for the folks at home who've been at work all day and now they want to watch the footy and they want a little bit of wraparound to go with that. They don't want a coaching manual, but also they don't want jokes galore and no insight. So I think you're trying to marry those two things, essentially: entertaining and informative.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Now, I'm always intrigued to hear about broadcasters' most memorable experiences as far as interviews and shoots. Are there any that come to mind for the right or even the wrong reasons? Because I feel like, as mentioned previously, before we started recording, those can very often be the stories that you tell after your career is over,
Yeah. I mean, there's been, luckily enough for me, because I've been doing it a long time, there's been a lot, and I'd say almost all positive. But obviously you have hard days for lots of reasons. You have tricky moments. Yeah, I've had, I wouldn't say exactly run-ins, but awkward kind of moments with a lot of managers in particular, where they're obviously not on the back foot, but they're defensive after a defeat or an awkward scenario, or there's a question you think you've got to ask and they don't really want you to ask and they don't want to answer it. And that happens a lot with particularly with prominent managers who are used to having things kind of their own way. They're kind of control freaks. That's the nature of the job, I think. So people like Fergie and Mourinho and Klopp and Guardiola in the common time, I think in the modern time, they don't want to be pushed around, and they are clearly the experts, the world leading experts in their field. So you have to have a lot of modesty about not wasting their time, trying to think about questions that you think the audience will want to know, but don't take the liberty and don't presume to engage in some kind of combative sport with them. Don't let them off, but ask questions. Try and get something from them that the audience would want to know. Don't overstate your understanding, your subjective opinion, knowledge, whatever. That's not what you're there for. You're there to be a conduit for the audience. So you do have those days where you think, oh, that was tricky, that was tough. They didn't really want to answer that. So you can, but always think about how to make it better next time. And don't spoil a relationship that's going to come back to you. So if you're going to talk to a manager, and it's going to probably, because of their prominence and the competitions you're covering, if you're going to come up against them relatively regularly, don't be too adversarial, because that relationship needs to be constructive. Again, you don't have to let them off with anything. You don't have to pussyfoot around. You need to be a good journalist, but you don't need to have a fight every time. Is it worth it? Is it fair? And is it worth asking? If you can tick those two boxes, you're always on the front foot, and you're always on the right foot, I would say. And you can say to a press officer or a producer back at base or whatever, it seemed to me that was the right way to go. They didn't like it, but I think we got somewhere. And I think most of the professionals in sport will accept that. If it's constructive and it's a reasonable question, and it's a question rather than your opinion, they'll accept that. They might not like it, but I don't think they'll take you to task over it. But if you start parading or taking them to task about their knowledge, wrong avenue.
That is most definitely the truth. But alongside that, I also feel that it would take a level of maturity to reach the correct execution of that, almost. If you know what I mean. So to glean it is one thing, but to be able to execute that is a different thing, which leads me nicely into one of the questions that I was keen to ask. Was there a moment, I mean, this could obviously be at any point of your career early on, but was there a moment where you felt an immense feeling of accomplishment or validation that you were on the right path and this was going to be the career for you?
I don't know if there's nothing springs to mind where I think that was a big leap forward for me. I think it's a time honored thing, really. I think the repetition, you're always the small lessons that you hope you're always learning from. There's been great days where you thought I was really privileged to be part of something and to be present at something that they're actually paying me for. Everyone else is buying a ticket and I'm actually getting paid for this. And I could pick, I suppose, a few examples. Very early on, when I was working for the Financial Times, I was sent to a big powwow, a business and political leaders powwow in Switzerland called the World Economic Forum. And I was only young. This was in the early 90s. And I was, for about 5 minutes only, I was able to be in a room and ask a couple of questions of Nelson Mandela.
Wow.
Which is pretty,
that's big.
Pretty special for anybody. But he'd only, I think, been released from prison maybe a couple of years earlier. He hadn't yet become president of South Africa. He was in a power sharing time with the then President de Klerk. And so that was amazing. That was amazing. And that where you have to kind of, you don't have to, it's pretty obvious. You pinch yourself and think, wow, what a privilege this is. And then lots of other times in a sporting context, presenting a Champions League final and an FA Cup final for ITV, getting to do the Ashes for BT Sport, obviously now TNT Sport, doing a number of Olympics, going to World Cups for ITV and BBC before that, European Championships, loads and loads of really pleasurable and privileged moments, and particular days. Istanbul in 2005, Moscow in 2008, when there was two English teams, obviously in the pouring rain, in Chelsea and Man United, and loads more after that. I mean, I've been lucky enough to have a long career, and thus I've been to a lot of interesting places and met a lot of interesting people, and all of those things I think then serve to underpin the reporter, the broadcaster, the presenter. You try to maintain the kind of quality and experience that you can hopefully bring to bear.
Yeah, A selfish question, if you will, from my own perspective, but obviously I'm always very, I would say grateful when it, because I had an inkling that you were from from the north. I didn't know you were from from Merseyside. So
Mm.
you obviously would have grown up in this bubble of football where to me, for example, my main sports are football and fighting. So football or boxing or mixed martial arts. Although I've worked on other sports and I'd like to think I give those um, the same amount of attention and research and professionalism. Um, there's almost at first a friction when it comes to um, understanding the sports, if you know what I mean. I mean, you mentioned the Ashes, you mentioned the Olympics prior to that.
Mm.
Um, what is your approach when it comes to covering different sports?
Well, obviously, because you work on them more, as you rightly pointed out, you become more comfortable in your knowledge of and so on. But your role is never to be the expert. It's not to be the pundit. It's not to be the analyst. That obviously there are people who've spent a lifetime in and around the sport who provide that for you and for the
Mhm.
audience at home. So as much as we're always trying to find stuff out, be informed, be experienced enough to distinguish what's a good question and what's a bad question, we are still asking questions. Our job as journalists is, again, to condense the information and present it, hopefully, in a way via questions more than answers that that the audience finds informative and entertaining. So don't overthink it. Don't try and become something you're not. If I'm working on, as I did at the Olympics, I was working on a new and different sport almost every day. It was great. I loved the variety of it. I was doing cycling one day, badminton the next, water polo the next, equestrian events the next, and it was, and sometimes only finding out at 10 o'clock at night. So it is needs must. You can't. You can spend, of course, you're going to spend an hour or so reading around the basics of the event, the leading athletes within it, so that you can do a decent job the next day of talking to people, finding stuff out on camera and off camera that eventually becomes a report that people would want something from. But you're not going to become a dressage expert in an evening. That's ridiculous. So use the same journalistic toolbox that you've always used and just pick up the bits that make the bare minimum of what the job entails. So be as ready as you can be, but don't kid yourself that you're turning up with some kind of riding hat on and pair of breeches or whatever they're called, jodhpurs, I don't know, and become the instant expert. That's both silly and pretentious. So don't
Mhm.
do it. Basically, remember what you're there for, which is to ask questions and find stuff out.
Okay. This podcast has been full of gems of knowledge and information, which has always been my ambition with the podcast. I always look to learn things from people that I
Yeah.
speak to, and I've most definitely done that today. Just to wrap it up with one final question, as I know the nominees have come through over the last day or so. Who's your pick for the upcoming Ballon d'Or?
Yeah, it's quite an open one, this group, isn't it? Really,
Yeah.
and there'll always be that discussion around. Well, hang on, how come he's not on there, and why is he on there, and blah blah blah. So it's so subjective. I'm not actually a massive fan of the individual awards for any team sport, really, because I think the context of a team environment is so important. So I'm not that big a fan of them. I understand, obviously, they have a kind of commercial drive, and there are clearly key individuals in any team sport, but they're only as good as their teammates, I think, and their coach and the
Hmm.
backroom staff, and they'd be the first to say that. I think we've probably lived through an era of the last 20 years with Messi and Ronaldo where they've been outstanding, kind of seminally brilliant individuals, slightly different each from the other. And again, it's very subjective. So all those caveats applying. Who is this year's Ballon d'Or winner for me? I mean, you could make a case for a lot of them, couldn't you? I just think I think it goes too rarely to a defender or a goalkeeper. I know they now
Interesting.
almost created a new award, particularly the Ashin Award for the goalkeepers, but it's kind of the temptation is always to go for the goal scorer. And yes, it's the hardest thing, and yes, they're the best paid for a reason, and all that stuff. But actually, I think I'd probably, the risk of being shot down in flames, I think it's who's made the biggest leap forward in the last 12 months, I think it's probably Jude Bellingham.
Interesting.
I think he's gone from huge potential to, in one season at Real Madrid, world-class, game-dominating, class-leading midfielder. Are there many, if any, midfielders in world football that would say, I'm ahead of him? But now he's got so much to his game. And a part of that, I suppose, is that how much better can he still get? But what a debut season at Real Madrid, to win League and Champions League, to score the 20-plus goals that he did, to catch fire straight away without a striker in the team, to become all the things that he did in the course of that season. I spoke to him after the game against Leipzig, which actually Real Madrid were very lucky to qualify in. He set up Vinicius for the only goal of the game that night, and they were lucky because Leipzig missed a load of chances. But it was great to have a very brief chat with him post-match. He's very engaging, smart, bright, open, interested, curious individual. It will be easy to be wrapped up in his own little bubble, and yet he seems a sponge for football and life beyond football at the moment at such a tender age. And he really impressed me. He impresses me as a footballer, and he impresses me as a person. So with perhaps a bit of bias, I'll go for Jude.
Can't dispute that. Can't dispute that at all. It's been an absolute pleasure, Matt. It's been great to sit and speak with you.
No, my pleasure.
I can only thank you for your time, and I do hope that our paths cross again at some point.
I hope so too, Max. And as you rightly point out, it's always good to learn from other people. I'm learning from you. Hopefully, the folks listening to this are learning a bit from both of us. And I'm off to pick up the flowers. And the cat's been sick now in the background as well.
Oh,
so
no.
That's the rest of my afternoon. The glamour, eh?
Thanks for your time, Matt.